Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation. It's a privilege for me to introduce to you and welcome Professor Paul Worley amongst us. He is getting acclimatized. He spent yesterday with us in Worcester and we were in Hermanus last night and this morning with students in the hospital and we are here now for the next day and a half. Paul has just finished 2 terms as Dean of the School of Medicine at Flinders University in Adelaide. The School of Medicine includes medicine, pharmacy, OT, physio, nursing, dietetics, and optometry, and a number of others I'm sure I have left out. So it is not in our context of a School of Medicine that's just about medicine. It's medicine with others included. He came into that position after having been an academic in Flinders for many years, having been the pioneer in establishing the Rural Clinical School at Flinders University, the first such school in Australia, in fact, which then subsequently led to the federal government-sponsored program of developing rural clinical schools in all the medical schools in Australia. He came to that after many years as a rural doctor and being frustrated with the kind of graduates that they were receiving or were not receiving, as was usually the case in rural practice and the challenges of that. He is currently in a new position as Executive Medical Director of Country Health, which in our context means rural health in South Australia, responsible for 60-odd hospitals in South Australia, and is also Professor Emeritus in the Ukwanda Centre of Medical Education Research. He's going to be talking to us now about decentralised health professions training. So thank you, Paul, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Jim, for the pleasure to be back in Stellenbosch. In Australia, we make it a point to reflect on our history when we are conducting an academic meeting, and we would acknowledge at Flinders University the Garden people who are the Indigenous custodians of land. So I would like to acknowledge the Koi, and I understand there are a number of varieties of nations within that grouping, but reflect on the fact that both from the history of the Koi, then the various colonial groups that have been on this place prior to the formation of South Africa and then Stellenbosch University as an institution here. What we're talking about in terms of health professions education has been going on in this place for tens of thousands of years. And we are talking about a very small period of time in that multitude of thousands of years. And I like to reflect on that. It is humbling, I think, for us in the Western tradition to realise that many went before us and we have much to learn from them. And also in the context of what we're talking about today in terms of decentralised health professions education, in many ways the process that has gone on in forming universities in new countries and medical schools and health professions schools in new countries is itself a process of decentralisation. And I'll get to that a little bit in the past, but your country, like our country, is going through the debates and the discourse of decolonising curriculum, decolonising our understandings of health. And that process also, I would tenet, is very much aligned with the process of decentralisation as well. Just one word, and then on the word decentralisation, I don't like it as an Aussie. I find it a critical theory nightmare, because I think it is about power. It's implying there is a central power, and it's implying a challenge to that central power that I don't think is actually the answer. In our context, challenging that central power has never worked. Working with has worked far better. Acknowledging the strengths of both places of origin and the new places we want to work has worked far better than trying to anything. But I realise the debate's been had here, so I'll work with that, and I'll also try over this week to learn why you've used that term, because I think that probably will help us in Australia as well, because I'm sure that you have had significant debate about that, and that there are very good reasons for why you're using that term rather than other terms like distributed or networked or other approaches that you could use. The other reason I want to acknowledge the history is that my fourth great-grandfather lived in this place. Temporarily, he was a chaplain in the military here on the Cape. He ended up being a convict in Australia because he was not the most glorious of chaplains. In fact, in terms of professional standing and the importance of regulation, his certification as a chaplain was fake. Which, although that didn't kill anybody, which a fake doctor may, it did mean there were a lot of illegitimate children born to people who thought they'd been married by a priest and actually in fact hadn't. And I believe that the laws of the Cape Colony were actually had to be changed because of my ancestor to enable those people to have legitimate marriages that had been married illegitimately by him. So my apologies for my ancestry, and I thank you for welcoming back the family these generations after to what is a stunningly beautiful place. The last few days I've had here, both around Table Mountain and then in the Wide District and down at the Mines has just been heavenly, just beautiful. However, the world is not all a beautiful place, and I don't know how you have found the events of Europe recently, but the more recent explosions and attacks, and this was very relevant for us because we had one of our students killed on London Bridge when the person drove the car and then just started stabbing and randomly killing people. She went to help some of the people who had been injured, and then herself was killed. But what that did for me was when I went to our football, the rugby that you would have here, and I was in a big crowd, I felt myself looking over my shoulder, thinking, what if? What is that person doing? They've got a rucksack on, they've got a bag, they look a bit different to me, they look a bit nervous. What's going on here? There was almost as if there was this fear that had been multiplied across the world by those events. And I reflected on that, and reflected on my experience as a rural doctor, and thought, well, that fear that you are feeling is no greater fear than the fear that a woman in a small town in Australia or in a small town in South Africa feels when the doctor leaves. And they're worried about their child getting croup or having a seizure with no medical service there. Or if they're pregnant, what happens if I deliver before I can get to the hospital that's 2 or 3 hours away? Or if I have an elderly father who may be demented, what happens if he gets worse and there is no care. That fear that is part of the life of many people who live in underserved towns is very real. We as health professions institutions have a role in combating that fear. More than that, in fact, creating hope for those people by providing health services and health professions and the evidence for those professionals to work that actually brings security to people wherever they are. It was expressed in a way by a Russian professor about 100 years ago. No country can be proud of its medical progress if that progress is only available to a select few. So when we're looking at that concept of decentralisation, I very much view that in terms of the democratisation of the availability of high quality healthcare and the role of health professions institutions in enabling a country to be able to say we have achieved that or we are achieving that. When I speak about this in Australia, many universities will say, that's okay, but that's for another university, it's not for us. Our DNA is here in this tertiary hospital. That's who we are. And perhaps it needs other institutions to look after the training of professionals for other areas. I would put to you that that's a mistaken view of the genome versus the proteome, or the genotype versus the phenotype. The phenotype may well be, and the first expression of an institution's DNA may well be in a tertiary hospital, with the research, education and clinical service, quality and creativity that embodies. But that doesn't mean that's the only expression of that institution's DNA. That DNA can find expressions in very different contexts and environments and still remain true to itself. In genetics or immunology, we would talk about the impact of the epigenome with the genome determines protein expression and determines the outcomes. And the epigenome is just as important as the genome. Read for epigenome the context. The context is just as important. So if we would say that the genome of this institution is the values of the institution, values of integrity, of excellence. I understand commitment has been changed to compassion recently, and that is very meaningful to me. And values of accountability. Those values have found expression in this context as Tygerberg Hospital and the affiliated health services around it. Find a different epigenetic context and those values can have just as profound an expression in other areas. I see this as an analogy of decentralisation, that concept of moving away from one set of epigenetic factors that has meant those values are expressed here in one way, to another set of context or epigenetic factors that mean those same values, same very important core values, can be expressed in different ways, equally importantly and equally profoundly. So what are some of the epigenetic contexts in terms of health professions education that may be affecting those values? Some of those are internal. Some of those are the changes that are occurring in the university sector. So if we look at the educational changes that are occurring, that might modify or change the expression or cause us to think about changing the expression of those values. The educational changes that are occurring around the importance of social accountability. In other words, universities and their education being accountable to the communities they serve. Or about the educational changes that are occurring around the relevance of education. Now, the relevance of education became really important and clear to me when I looked at White's evidence about the epidemiology of who gets into a tertiary hospital. So you look at 100 people who are sick in a community. Out of 1,000 people, 100 might be sick at any one time. One of those eventually finds their way to a Tigerberg equivalent. But we are creating a health service to service the 100. It's a pretty tall ask to ask students to only learn on the one and then have to translate that to the whole other 100 or other 99. Let alone work with the other 900 in terms of prevention and promotion. So those realities that Flexner identified in terms of where is the science, where are the patients, they're in tertiary hospitals, that's where we should have health professions education. That has changed, and we now have a far more ambulatory health system. We have a far more decentralised health system. Along with that must go a decentralised education system. That has been no more evident, I think, than Thailand, which has decentralised its health delivery system, decentralised its education system. Some of the South American countries have likewise done that. Doesn't mean the values are any different, but it means the epigenetic factors, the contexts are very different. Then we take the other big value of an educational institution, research. So I've been talking with people as I've gone around, and people are saying, well, if we look at Worcester, is that rural? Some people say that's not really rural. I'll show you rural. And they're talking about something further away. In fact, many people will talk about rural and underserved as being the same thing. They're not. There are many underserved communities here in Cape Town. There are many, thankfully, well-served communities in rural areas. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. We should be proud of that we have rural communities that are well-resourced and well-served, and therefore able to be very good training grounds for our graduates. However, the practice in those places is different to the practice in tertiary hospitals. And therefore the evidence base for care needs to be different. A classic example of that is, and in a way I'm starting to use this as my definition of rural, is if you have a stent, if you have an ST elevation myocardial infarction, what is the benchmark that your hospital uses for treatment? Is it time to stent, or is it time to thrombolysis? If it's time to stent, you're probably in an urban area. If it's time to thrombolysis, or if you're in a Western well-resourced country, you would be in an urban area. If it's time to thrombolysis, you're highly likely to be in a rural area. And so I talked to the people at Worcester, and they said, well, for us it'll be time to thrombolysis. That would be our benchmark for care. And that's one example of where the gold standard and the evidence that's required to inform best practice needs different research in rural areas to that which is conducted in the cities. Now, how do we create our evidence base? We create it through medical schools, through health professions schools, and we do that where we teach. So if we're not teaching in those areas, it's highly unlikely that we're going to be creating evidence that's relevant to those areas. And if you look at the history of the evidence for medical care and health professions care, it's littered with examples of guidelines being developed that are inappropriate for rural areas. Very appropriate for urban tertiary sector, but very inappropriate for rural areas. And that's just not good enough. That's not good enough for the values of our organisation. That's our genetics ignoring the epigenetics. And we can't afford to do that. So internally, in terms of education, the changes in education and values and the need for research, there are strong driving factors for why decentralised medical education needs to be seen as a natural evolution of our genotype. But there are external factors as well. It's not just the microbiome that affects the genome, it's also the external environment, poisons, what we eat, all of those sort of things. So what are some of those things that are affecting the way we express our values? The first would have to be government policy. Now, you've seen that, we've seen that, the clinical training grant, a wonderful opportunity to actually enhance decentralised education. But what happens when that stops? But the policy requirement continues. What about the policy around Cuba? Far more of an issue for you here in Africa than it is in Australia, but our near neighbours in East Timor are working through the same issues of large numbers of students coming back who've been trained in an entirely different epigenetic environment and are not suited to the environment that they're coming to work in. But I understand that you're going to be confronted with hundreds of near graduates to work through the system in South Africa. A government policy that puts pressure on places, that puts pressure on clinical training places. And one of the external pressures that certainly influences organisations towards decentralisation is the pressure on clinical places. So the pressure to find new places to train. It's a pity if that's the only reason, because that's sort of saying, well, if we really have to, we'll move from here, rather than actually there are some really good and important reasons of why we want to express who we are in these different environments. There are some positive reasons for that. But one of the other, I think, external reasons for decentralised training is the democratisation of knowledge. By that I mean that nearly all of the information that you give to your students around the basic sciences is available to every bus driver who has a mobile phone. They may not be able to understand it or make sense of it, but it's available. And in fact, some of the best lecturers in the world are on YouTube. And you just Google them and you can get the lecture and everything that we deliver in our case-based learning, your learning. And it doesn't just stop at the basic sciences, it's the clinical sciences as well. So there's this incredible democratisation of knowledge that's occurred. And there's the changes in travel and IT. The changes that have got us back to a pre-World War I approach to globalisation of business, such that what would happen if instead of Imperial College and Duke College going to Singapore, they said, well, why don't we come to South Africa? We can link up all of our lecturers there and we'll pick off all the students who would like to have a Duke or an Imperial qualification instead of a local qualification. We're certainly facing that in Australia. In fact, we've had one of our universities try and do the same. Monash came to here, not with a medical school. They've tried that in other places and it's worked in Malaysia, it didn't work in some places. But that globalisation of education is only going to get greater. And that is a decentralisation on a global scale of education that potentially threatens what I would call here indigenous products of health professions education. So in a way, there's a survival issue happening here as well. I know the Open University was looking at a platform whereby they could have thousands of medical students enrolled every year into an open platform. And all they would then do is go around and negotiate with different hospitals around the world to undertake their clinical training. And they would have a global university. Now, those sort of things you may say, oh, that's never going to happen. UCT and Stellenbosch, they're the only medical schools that are going to be in Cape Town forever. That hasn't been the case in Australia. Decentralisation has occurred by government policy outside of the existing universities. They said we don't want to do it. The government said, okay, we'll just make a new one. So we went from 8 medical schools to 10. That stayed 10 medical schools for a long time. We're now 22. So that's decentralisation despite the medical schools resisting it. So if you think of, again, the genome of this organisation, there are potential external threats to the existence of the organisation that are encompassed in the term decentralisation. I talked about the original sort of colonial history here, and in many ways, I understand that UCT was the first medical school in South Africa about 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. So that was a decentralisation act on behalf of this country, because prior to that, to become a doctor, you would have had to go back to Europe. And I'm not sure when the time came, but I imagine it was much after that, that you actually had a South African authority accrediting the medical schools here. I know for us in Australia, it was the middle of last century, we still had the British Medical Council giving credibility to our medical schools and our health professional schools. So we had to, if you like, undertake a decentralisation of that process. Decolonisation of that process. They were the same thing for us in Australia, as I believe they're the same thing in many ways here in South Africa for your institutions. So that historical perspective is also another reason why we can't stand still in this space, and we can't be token in what we're doing. Many people would say if as an organisation you're not growing and changing, then you are actually dying, you are actually moving backwards. And universities around the world, I think, are struggling with what that means, with the radical disruption that new generations of students, new generations of technology, and new expectations of society are placing on what has been quite an ordered life for a number of decades. With that also comes opportunities for those that are most nimble and most adaptive. That's evolution. And the question in each of our countries is going to be which of our universities, our health professional schools, are actually adaptive and actually see this not as just a defence, but actually as an opportunity for radical change. I'll finish briefly, and I haven't gone into a whole lot of, well, how did Flinders do this? Because I've talked about that many times in Africa before, and I'm happy to answer questions on how did we transform ourselves from being a tertiary academic health science centre to being a tertiary, secondary and primary care academic health science network. Same DNA, different expression of that across 3,000 kilometres. But I have to say that part of the reason for that was that if we didn't do it, others would come in and do it for us. Despite us, and potentially we may not have existed. The reason we moved to a graduate medical program was as a defence to being shut down. Now, that's not written anywhere, and please don't go back and tell, in actual fact it is written because it's written written in many committee meetings, but it's not promoted. What's promoted is that graduate entry was seen as a fantastic thing to do for society, and it is, and it has been for our school. And it was an adaptive process against an external threat that meant we had to change the way our DNA was expressed in the same way as decentralisation can lead to an adaptive, proactive change to the way any institution expresses itself. Saying that, my experience here at Stellenbosch is that you are very well placed. The places I have visited, which in many ways are your pilots, I would see them as pilots of decentralisation that could be expanded greatly. But those pilots are really high quality. They are attracting staff and students who I can see the transformation that is going on in them and is going on in the health services around them. And the discussion that a number of us had on a ward round this morning in Hermanus made me realise that you also have a rich opportunity for research. We were talking about the issues confronting a person with atrial fibrillation and newly diagnosed octogenarian with atrial fibrillation. And whilst in many centres that would very quickly move to a variety of checklists and the difference between this drug and that drug and compliance issues and those sort of things around warfarin. The discussion here was moving towards, well, what other therapists need to be involved in the assessment of the meaning of this illness for this person and this person's family and ability to cope? And what is the priority of the investigations that we should be doing? Because we don't have unlimited resources and we can't do every investigation that might be listed in up to date. So what are the priorities in this rural environment for the care of this person? And there wasn't a clear evidence base from places like Up to Date, which is what I would look up at Flinders. And I was accused in my suggestions to the students, well, that's okay for you in the first world. You might want to do that. And I went, oh boy, what's happened to the kid from the country when he's being accused of being in the first world? In a place that I look at and I see, well, actually, that looks a reasonably well-resourced part of rural South Africa. But still, there were differences. So great opportunities for educational innovation, great opportunities for research innovation, great opportunities for your institutional DNA to respond to the epigenetic changes that are occurring around us and to be a leader in the transformation that needs to go on if the progress in medical service, research and education is truly going to be available to everyone in our societies. I'll leave you with that challenge.
I just wanted to say what I really appreciated was the way in which you brought it to all of us and to what's happening here at Tygerberg and happening at Stellenbosch. So thank you very much for that. But I'm going to open the floor now to questions, comments. I think we've had a lot to think about, so let's open the floor.
What you said about the underserved kind of triggered me in a positive way, because I think it is true to say that 15-20 minutes from here you will have find a large population of underserved, as much as you would find in many rural areas in this country. So I guess the question is, what can we learn from the experience you've had in Australia? What can we learn about service to the underserved? And what do you mean by underserved? Is it medically underserved only, or are you thinking beyond that?
Look, do you want me to start the lecture again and I'll talk about that, because absolutely great questions, Jimmy. The underserved can be a pejorative term, and it can be a term that's used by the wealthy to the great unwashed, and that is just sticks in me. So we have to be really careful because if I look at my personal experience was I trained in rural health because I wanted to go and work in the South Pacific in mission areas, places I saw as underserved. However, what I saw there was that the social services that they had were actually far and above the social services that many of the communities in Australia, in rural Australia, had. So I decided instead of going and working there, I actually needed to come and work much closer to home. In other words, instead of flying over a whole lot of disadvantage to go to somewhere else, I actually needed to look in my own backyard. And much of the West flies over their own backyard to serve the underserved. Most people use quite technical definitions when they're talking about it. They look at doctor-patient ratios, they look at health worker ratios, they look at morbidity and mortality indices and make references to that. They look at preventable diseases and those sort of things. So the assumption being if there's a higher amount of preventable disease, then there's an underserving of something. So I think we can do that. I think we can use those metrics to guide us and realise that there actually isn't a cut-off, that having an arbitrary cut-off of if you're above this line you're served and if you're below this line you're underserved doesn't actually work because there's a whole lot of relativity. So for instance, I was in Worcester, which I would regard actually as quite a well-served area, but I went to Avian Park. Avian Park is a very underserved area, which, by the way, your university has done a wonderful thing in terms of providing a collaborative care service to that community that has no health service. So right in the middle of quite a wealthy town is an area that is totally underserved and has been recognised by people. So in terms of the definition, in terms of what can be learned, my sense is that the people who are committed to serving rural communities have a lot in common with people who want to serve underserved communities. There's a social justice element in the DNA, if you like. And I see that in the values of Stellenbosch. It talks about equality as being one of the aspirations. So there is that social justice there. But there's also a difference, because the issues of rurality are often more around access. They're often more about generalism in practice, whether that be in the therapies, in nursing or in medicine. In urban underserved, they're about access to subspecialty services that may be very close, but there's all sorts of reasons for why people can't access them, be they financial, be they transport, be they cultural, etc. So the type of practice solution is often different in a rural environment because of the diseconomies of scale. Underserved areas in cities usually don't have diseconomies of scale. They have other reasons for why they are underserved. Whereas the rural areas is often it's issues of scale and distance that we're having to combat. And so we therefore need different approaches to treatment, different benchmarks, etc. What we at Flinders have found is that a lot of the lessons that we've learned by experimenting, and I use that word deliberately, we used our rural education in an experimental model. We researched, we studied it, we had people come from outside to look at it with fresh eyes. We used those learnings to inform what we then did in our urban backyard. And more than that, we actually then used that to inform what we did in our tertiary hospital. So a lot of the learnings that we have taken from our rural communities, we we have now been able to reverse engineer back to, if you like, the centre. So the decentralisation is not just a one-way thing, it's actually a loop. That's what we've been able to learn. It's taken us probably a good 20 years for that learning, but I would hope that that's what Stellenbosch will find as well, is that they will find expertise in these other sites that they recognise they haven't had where they've been, and that adds to the richness, the diversity, and then can inform best practice and all of that back in the centre, if you like. I try not to use hub and spokes and all of that, because again, there's a power thing going on there. But the network becomes a learning network. I probably prefer the sort of complexity system approach to the as a descriptor of what we're doing. And certainly you can learn from all points in the system.
Big.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. There's a statement that you made that's struck a chord with me, and I think that many people agree that this whole concept of decentralization, whatever you want to call it, is in fact a very good idea. That is something that somebody else needs to do.
It's a bit like a nuclear waste dump.
Absolutely.
It's really good, we need to have one, but not in my backyard, please. We have that in Australia at the moment.
Sure. So that's in fact my question. How do you actually get your faculty to accept the idea, to buy into the idea, and work with expanding or buying into this whole concept of decentralization? How did you guys manage it?
Okay, so a number of things. First of all, a lot of this you can learn just through the theory of change literature. So there's a big literature on the theory of change and the various early uptakers and what needs to go on. You can also apply motivational interviewing approaches. So what we teach our students in the various disciplines about the pre-contemplative stage and the contemplative stage and all of that sort of thing. So a lot of those processes. But so if you're looking for literature, there's a whole literature on that. There's also a literature that one of my PhD students is teaching me about, which is about institutional entrepreneurship. And that is important as well, because you end up with people like the Ians of this world, or Hoffy before him, who are institutional entrepreneurs who are agents of change. And I'm sure there are probably a number of those people in this room, because they're probably the people who are attracted to learn about this sort of topic. But in general, my answer to you would be a biblical one. First seek to understand. First seek to understand. What I found at Flinders was that I actually had far more in common with my tertiary colleagues than I originally thought, or they originally thought. And when we got down to those basic principles of what we were wanting to do in education or in research or in practice, there was far more in common than there was that was different. Our contexts, again, may have been different, but our DNA was actually remarkably similar. So by appealing to those fundamental values and concepts, rather than the superficial expression of those, historic expression of those, there was a lot more that we could gain. The second thing about that is that we avoided an us and them. So, and this is one of the things that I think you are at the tipping point here in terms of Ukwanda, in terms of the Rural Clinical School, is it an us and them? Is it sort of, there's Tigerberg and there's the Rural Clinical School, and there's an us and them. Who's the us and who's the them depends on where you are, but that whole principle. So we work very much for a we, an our, O-U-R process to this. In other words, we recognised that we couldn't do what we were doing in our decentralised sites without links, strong links to the centre. I'm using that language, I know, but just go with it if you can. So much so that in the first year, when our students in the Worcester equivalent came back with their exam results, and we had one student who topped the year, one student who was third, one student who was seventh, one student who was 10th. Yes, I remember these things. They were 20 years ago, but I remember it very carefully. All 8 were in the top quarter of the class. I was at the exam board, and we had the professor of medicine, the professor of surgery, the professor of paediatrics all around there, and here was me, senior lecturer in rural health. And what I heard was, wow, our students in the Riverland have done really well, haven't they? From the professor of medicine. So it wasn't your students or those students, it was our students. There was that sense of this is actually an institutional-wide endeavour. Yes, it was important in that first instance that I didn't take any money away from them. So the Dean didn't have to take money from the departments in Flinders Medical Centre and rip it out and send it over there. We got external money. Only a small amount, but it meant that we didn't have to take money. What we did do was we lightened the load of students, and that was an attractive thing. So again, looking for what was attractive, making it a win-win us, and realising that we have a lot more in common than we have. So for instance, the person who was really antagonistic against this, he said to me, I will do everything I can to make sure this fails. But this is totally against what Flinders stands for. Both his parents were rural doctors. Now he hadn't got on with his parents. But once I understood what was behind that sort of approach and could talk to him about that, he then became the greatest protagonist for us. He would go and convince other schools that this is what they needed to do. So what appears to be antagonism at the outset, usually there are very good reasons for that, valued reasons, and if you can understand those, then you can usually work with those to get an even better outcome. Does that make sense?
Great.
Thanks. And so I think what struck me today was the power of language. And so
I apologise if my language has offended anyone. No, truthfully, I didn't intend to.
no, it wasn't a reprimand. It's around how we use language. And so my colleagues know that I'm also not a supporter of decentralised for the very reason around the centralisation of hospital and tertiary care. So in South Africa, we have 10 central hospitals, which are the tip of the hierarchy of health care. And so it talks exactly to what you're saying in terms of how do you distribute health care, how do you speak to equity of access to health care if you have a triangle. And if you look at the healthcare systems in our province, in other provinces, everybody draws a triangle. I mean, the tip is small,
Yes.
the base is big, but it is a triangle. And so I think for me it's what you're saying is how do we change the discourse. So I like your analogy to the genome, because I think it resonates with scientists and with tertiary physicians.
Exactly.
And so I think it's how we must really respond to the need for us to change what we do as an institution of how, as you say, express our our DNA expression in different contexts. And so I think part of the difficulty one has in South Africa is that we have on paper a health act, healthcare policy that speaks to universal access to health, but the government policies don't align to it. So how we allocate resources doesn't align. And so I think that it's going to be part of our challenge, and we as an institution need to, I think we made a little bit of a quantum leap in terms of the school, but we now ready for our next leap. And so what is that leap going to be in terms of taking, I think what you're saying is the democratization of health and healthcare and knowledge to a different level. So it resonates, I think, with what the institution wants to do in terms of its social impact policy, in terms of what we see in 2030, what the provincial government sees in 2030. And I suppose it's when the head of medicine asks the question, because I think he's the head of medicine.
I didn't realise that.
So it goes well.
Thank you. Look, Trace, thank you for the comment. I mean, as a visitor, I see South Africa incredibly important globally, because in many ways you are at that crossroads between the developing and the developed world. You're at the pointy end of colonisation and multiple languages and cultures, and your experience of both the chronic disease and the infectious sort of vertical paradigm and the horizontal paradigms that the WHO talk about are, are right here. They're real. They both are important. All of that. So the solutions that you come up with here are going to be important globally. Probably more important if you can work things out here. More important globally than even a country like Australia in terms of what we've been able to do. And what I can say is that you won't be able to do it alone. You will have to do this with the health service. So in many ways it's going to be a discussion around what is the DNA of the health service as well, and the different expressions of that. In different places you can appeal to different motivators. So what I've found is that at the tertiary level, many people look to Europe and the United States for the lead in terms of what tertiary and quaternary healthcare systems are looking like. Rightly or wrongly, they do it. And if you look at the United States, for instance, they're very much moving away from academic health science centres to academic health science networks. If you look at the health insurance companies, they're very much looking at, they would call it vertical integration of primary, secondary and tertiary care. Now they may be doing that for reasons different to what we're doing it for. There may be very much a profit motive behind what they're doing. However, they also are accumulating at the same time evidence of better health outcomes through that integrated process. So what is the integrative process that the health systems in South Africa can work towards that you can partner with them? That will probably require evidence and research in terms of health sciences research, health systems research, to provide the evidence, but it will also need political will. You need the evidence. Once you've got the evidence, you then need the political will. And you've got the opportunity to do that. And you've certainly, I think, got a number of willing partners around the world to help along that way. In the Cape, I would have thought, if any area's got an opportunity to do it, it should be a place like the Cape. Why not lead it from here and let that infuse across the country?
Thank you. So my question is around, what is the relationship between a sort of more decentralized model of education and learning and the sort of balance between generalism and sort of generalist approach to learning versus sort of a specialist kind of approach to learning, something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I could answer that. The relationship. So the simple analogy we use to understand that is having many roads to the one goal. So in terms of, if you look at the course outcomes, the graduate attributes and the course outcomes and objectives, they need to have integrity and durability and be consistent. So if you get this degree, that's what the person can assume, the qualities and the competencies and attributes that you have. How you get there can be very different. And you can get there through the input of a number of specialties, or you can get there through generalists, or combinations of those. And we're recognising increasingly that you can get to those graduate outputs or those graduate attributes through different disciplines, being as your supervisor. Certainly in medicine, and probably to a lesser extent, unfortunately, in the therapies. I started a number of therapy courses in our school, and I found it harder to get the concept of it doesn't matter who your supervisor is, as long as they understand your curriculum. That was harder to get in physiotherapy and occupational therapy than it was in medicine. We could have OTs supervising our medical students, but we couldn't have doctors supervising our OT students. But if you look at that concept of many roads to the outcome, the different contexts of health service delivery will then show you how you can have a different educational process according to what the local context is. It needs a bit of imagination sometimes, of stepping aside from what you've assumed a curriculum looks like. So for us, there have been a number of enablers. One of those enablers has been an integrated assessment. Actually having an assessment that looks at all of those graduate attributes and competencies, rather than just subset by subset by subset by subset by subset. When you do the subsets, you inevitably create walls around those, and walls create curriculums, and curriculums create timetables. So by looking at an integrated assessment based on those outcomes, you create flexibility. And another has been looking at the issue of longitudinality. In other words, do we have to have a curriculum that is based year to year? A rather abstract concept if you think about it in terms of progressing a person from a high school student to ready for internship. To say that, well, every year there's a set of things that unless you get there you've got to repeat all of that. Again, the democratisation of knowledge and changes to assessment around progress testing, programmatic assessment for learning. I'll talk about these things a little bit later in the week about some of the facilitators. But there are things that you can do that give you the flexibility in your curriculum and your assessment to be able to assure citizens that the product that you produce is high quality, no matter which route that people have come from, and enable the teachers that you have to use their expertise maximally. You don't want a professor of medicine pretending to be an obstetrician and teach obstetrics. You want them to be able to teach what they love, what they're passionate about, and what they know really well. Different curricular frameworks can facilitate that to a more or lesser extent in the same way as you can facilitate generalists getting involved. I don't know if that's answered your question, because again, your question could have been the subject of a whole thesis, because it's a really important question. But the simple thing is you need both. You need generalists in a place where generalists are the predominant service providers, and you need specialists, subspecialists, where the system revolves around that service provision. And students can learn from both. If they know where to get to, I mean, it always surprises me. We recruit these amazingly intelligent students. You look at the percentage, the percentile that they have to be to get into courses at Stellenbosch. It's not 99th percentile, it's above that in terms of where they have to be. And then we give them very little choice in how they're going to learn, how they're going to get to this point. What I've found again and again is that given support, given high quality clinical environments and high quality clinicians who understand where they have to get to, students will also find pathways to where they need to get to. Many of us needed to do this in our postgraduate training. There wasn't a clear pathway and we had to find our way. Students of today can do the same in their undergraduate learning if we are able to give them the flexibility. I find that they actually surprise me by learning more than I ever thought they would learn. We in many ways constrain their learning by the curricular frameworks that we box them into.
We have time for one last quick question, perhaps? Comment? Everybody happy? So Paul, for us this is the start. I know you've been elsewhere, but for us here at Tygerberg, this is the start of an exciting week, and we look forward to, many of us will be engaging with you as the days progress. I need to say that when I started the work on the rural clinical school, I knew nothing about rural health. I knew very little about health, full stop. And a lot of my first articles, this name popped up, this Worley, and a lot of work seemed to have been done by this person. And since then, I've met you, had the occasion to meet you at conferences, but it's a particular privilege to have you here with us. So thank you very much. This is from the Centre for Health Professions Education. This is Stellenbosch University's own wine. It's called Delan, which means the avenue. And I hope Ian will be taking you to Stellenbosch so you can go and see what Delan looks like.
Thank you very much.
But I think then a round of applause again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.